Hello, everyone, and welcome to our evening symposium exploring the topic of diversity and inclusion within the field of psychedelic research. So just a bit of housekeeping before we start. If everyone but the speaker can keep their mic off during the talks, just to minimize noise, and you can put your speaker view on to have them spotlighted. If you have any burning questions, we do have a panel Q&A at the end, which will be chaired by my colleague, Catherine. So you'll be able to take part in the discussion then. Just to introduce myself firstly, my name is Asta, and I'm a research nurse within the Psychedelic Trials group here at King's. And when thinking about why we even organized this event in the first place, I began reflecting on a study that we did last year, looking at the overall effects and safety of psilocybin, so aka the active ingredient of magic mushrooms, in healthy volunteers. And I remember scrolling through hundreds and hundreds of people who had expressed interest in taking part, and a recurring theme began to emerge. We ended up including 89 participants in the study, and I'll just show you the kind of ethnic breakdown of that group of people. Well, let me just share my screen. The majority of people that we included in that study were from white backgrounds. Now, while of course we're in England where the majority of people here are white, but the statistics weren't representative of the borough that we're in, so Southwark, as you can see here, nor were they representative of the overall demographics of the City of London as a whole, as you can see here. Which was quite interesting because we were literally getting interest from people from other European countries, so from abroad, to take part in our study. In fact, we had some of those actually fly in to stay in London for a week, to take part in the trial and then go back. So how is it that we weren't reaching these communities that were already based here, but we were reaching white people abroad? And so while the participants included in that study were equally balanced for sex and age, kind of purposefully, other aspects of diversity such as race or sexuality were not considered. And this isn't specific to the one study that we did. So moving on to a psilocybin for depression study, I'm witnessing the same trend emerge amongst our participants. And a literature review was actually done looking at the ethnic breakdown of participants across psychedelic studies in the United States. And they had a similar issue. This lack of diversity has been seen across psychedelic research in general. It's not limited to the one study we did. And why is this? Is it due to the valid mistrust of the scientific community based on historical atrocities committed in the name of research? I'll just give an example of that. So for instance, the famous Tuskegee experiment, which was a 40-year-long study of syphilis in Black men who were told they were being treated for kind of bad blood. Instead of being treated, they were subjected to invasive testing and observations. They never received the life-saving medication that became available. And in many cases, they passed on this disease to their wives and children. And when these families tried to get treatment from other doctors, they were blocked by the researchers. This is just one example. There is a history of unethical and inhumane experimenting that has been done on people from minority communities. So there's a lot of trust that needs to be rebuilt, but are the institutions doing enough to repair that relationship? So when thinking about other topics kind of related to the lack of diversity amongst our participants, kind of also thought about whether it's due to the association of psychedelics with white kind of peace and love hippies in the 60s, even though indigenous communities around the world have been using them for generations. So ayahuasca in countries such as Peru and Brazil and South America, or ibogaine in countries such as Gabon and Cameroon in Africa. And then also start to think about the relationship minority communities have with drug policies. So for instance, in the UK, Black and Asian people are more likely to be stopped and searched for drugs, even though self-reported studies have indicated these groups tend to use drugs at a lower rate than white people, and the find rate of drug searches being lower in these groups. then they are also convicted at higher rates. So for instance, Black people are convicted at 11.8 times the rate of white people for the personal possession of cannabis. And the organization released a full report around this topic. So if anyone's interested, they can look at these statistics a bit further. But it's clear that people from minority communities are disproportionately affected by the policies that come with the war on drugs that continues to be a tool of oppression. So you can see how it may affect people then taking part in studies that look at these substances, which are so closely connected to those policies. And then kind of thinking about the institutions themselves. So are they diverse enough? Are they prepared to adequately treat these communities? So this homogeneity that I mentioned isn't only seen amongst the participants. I remember a couple of months into this job, I attended a symposium that brought together people who were actively in the psychedelic field. So people such as psychiatrists, lobbyists, or those in the pharmaceutical industry, therapists. And there was only a handful of people from ethnic minority backgrounds there, which really showed me early on the lack of representation among the professionals themselves. Just to point out though that this is representative of research and higher education in general, so it's not limited to the psychedelic field. But then are the majority white males who are creating these protocols and systems to use these plant medicines within Western structures, considering the topic of diversity and inclusion, be it in the therapy that is delivered, the need for cultural competence and sensitivity, the recruitment processes, the screening tools and diagnostic criteria used that may be excluding certain communities, given the uniqueness of their experiences, which the very protocols are based on. Experiences such as trauma as a result of racism, homophobia, or sexism. I mentioned the war on drugs that has massively impacted minority communities, so trauma resulting from such systematic oppression needs to be acknowledged and taken into account in order to include and adequately support participants. Then when it comes to the wider psychedelic community that researchers are a part of, there is a matter of spiritual bypassing. So this is the use of spiritual ideas and practices to avoid unresolved issues and difficult topics. So this general notion of oneness and sense of psychedelic unity that is said to be the basis of a greater connection to the earth and to other people comes with the risk of issues associated with discrimination and oppression being avoided and dismissed, suggesting that talking about these differences is the problem rather than acknowledging and working on them. The saying of, oh, we're all the same, quickly becomes all lives matter. It's an excuse not to talk about difficult topics, and it literally bypasses people's experiences. So it's clear that there are various barriers to the inclusion of people from minority communities in psychedelic research. But unfortunately, this means that not only are people from these communities missing out on the opportunity to access these alternative treatments, but this leads to research that is unrepresentative of the general population. The medicines are then tried on and cater to the majority, which results in reported treatment outcomes that may not be generalizable to other groups. This is extremely important, especially if these medicines are to become licensed for future use within mental health. So we kind of hope that this and future events will shed more light on these various issues as well as solutions. Not only do we want to be talking about it, but there needs to be actions on alongside it. So for our team specifically, we're arranging to include topics like cultural competence and unconscious bias into our therapist trainings. And we're reviewing our recruitment methods with the hope of making our trials more inclusive. It is paramount that we continue this conversation with the aim of increasing representation and making psychedelic research more inclusive and mindful, which is why we're making this a series, with the next event currently being arranged for later this year. So yeah, watch this space. It is said that the more knowledge someone has, the more empathy they develop, and the more empathy they have, the more action they are called to. So I really want to thank everyone for coming and tuning in today and being open to learning, especially with everything going on at the world at the moment. there really is no time like the present to keep this momentum going. I know I myself, I'm really excited to learn from our speakers and this series as well. Just before we kind of start off, I'd like to mention the organisation Black Minds Matter, who we're donating the profits of this event to. So they are an organisation that aims to make mental health topics more relevant and accessible, working towards removing stigma and remodelling the services to be relevant for the Black community in the UK. At the moment, they're raising funds to cover or to connect those in need with a professional and culturally competent therapist and provide them with a free course of therapy. So they began against the backdrop of the pandemic, which disproportionately affected Black people, and the growing Black Lives Matter movement. Especially important given the frequent under-recognition of common mental disorders within the Black community at earlier stages of severity, and the overall poorer access to psychological therapies. So a great organisation. I'd suggest you kind of go and check them out. And so with that, we have two amazing speakers this evening. Our first speaker is Jill Pillage. Jill is a 51-year-old mother of two and grandmother of three. She's a qualified integrative counsellor who works in South London with a variety of clients, the majority of whom are Black women. Her background is communications and marketing and politics and local government. And then following her own personal crisis, she undertook a journey of transformation through psychotherapy and decided to devote her life to helping others discover themselves. She's currently studying her final year towards an advanced diploma in psychotherapy, which enables her to work at the level of a senior therapist from a spiritual perspective. Jill's also had many personal and transformational experiences with entheogens. So we're really grateful to have her here today to deliver her talk titled Some Personal Reflections. So I'll hand it over to you, Jill.
Thank you, everyone. I thought I would use this opportunity to share some personal reflections. I know there's a lot of theory behind this and a lot of statistics, but the best way, I thought, is to just share my personal story. Okay, so I'm going to share the screen with you right now. Okay, so some personal reflections of my journey with psychedelics, which started way back, actually, in the mid-90s, where I didn't have a name for it. All I knew is that it's ecstasy. And my friend said, have one, you'll enjoy yourself. And that was the beginning, the rave scene. And I was a shy 25-year-old at that time. And ecstasy really helped me transcend my self-consciousness. And what I remember about that rave scene back then was that there were people of all races. And at that point, you know, we'd go out with our Black friends. We wouldn't go out with anyone else. But I went into this rave scene that there was all these races, different cultures, varying able-bodiedness, you know. There'd be someone there deaf, but they could feel the bass line, you know. It was really beautiful. And what I realized quickly was, oh my goodness, I could recall this feeling at any time. Anytime I was feeling upset, I could go back to that without having to take MDMA again. And so for me, it was non-addictive, and I still pretty much believe it is non-addictive. And so when thinking about this presentation, you know, in hindsight, I see how this can work for conditions like PTSD or or race-based traumatic stress or post-traumatic slave syndrome, which is something that I learned about as I was working with Black clients and working with my own personal transformation. And so my journey continued, and in 2012 I was studying psychotherapy, and we were working with existential philosophy and being in the world. And I kept having this kind of bodily reaction that there was no mirror to my experience. We talked about everything but my experience. And when the lecturer came up with World War II and the Nazi death camps, yeah, we know that. I think we all know that. But there's Namibia, there's the Congo. But I found myself silent. I found myself not being able to speak my truth. And that's when I became aware of this conflicted part of myself, this false self in white spaces. I had to go off and look for literature that was relevant to my experience. It felt like always having to do things twice. When I began to share these experiences in class, I felt quite shocked because I was humiliated and shamed and blamed and told, you know, maybe it's because of this, maybe it's because you are like this, maybe it's because you are like that. And I wanted to say, no, it's not that. And said, you know, are you trying to make me feel guilty? And that's not what I was trying to do. I was trying to get a handle of my own experience within that group space, which was a microcosm of society. Having no luck, I had to work through it in therapy. And I found myself waking up at night thinking about what I could have said in class, and maybe I should have said this, maybe I should have said that. And my therapist helped me understand that there's an actual name for this. It's called recognition trauma. One thing I had to do was actually go and search after myself, search for my history, because it was as if we had no history before colonization. You know, I found this bunch of documentaries which I watched over and over again and soaked in the experiences of Africans before colonization, which is a really positive and real history. My journey carried on in 2014 when I took part in an ayahuasca ceremony. Back then the aim was to stop smoking, and I was in an abusive relationship at the time, quite emotionally abusive, very subtly so. And in therapy, I was describing how it felt like I was eclipsed, as if my identity had been stolen. And through the help of my therapist, we realized this echo-narcissist position was very much the same as I experienced in class. You know, this banging up against white supremacy and me being the other. And so I quickly began to realize that, you know, ayahuasca wasn't giving me what I needed. I wanted to stop smoking. And I kept getting different experiences that were all personal, racial, and transformational. The first one, I found myself giving birth. And I was quite aware that I was giving birth to humanity. And later found out about mitochondrial Eve in Africa. And why was I given that experience? I don't know. Then I had a journey, the longest journey. As a prepubescent girl, when I looked down at myself, my skin was very dark. Around about 10, 11 years old, on this journey on a slave ship. Then I had another journey of what I recognized was this long walk where I was forced out of my home and felt forced to walk from one side of America to the other. And later I went away and looked that up and found the Trail of Tears. Why was ayahuasca giving me these experiences? At this point, I had made friends with the two facilitators, and we were doing underground sessions in my home. I'd invited them in to do these underground sessions. And so what I came to understand slowly was the pain of indigenous Black and brown people and the displacement of them and the continued suffering that exists in the world, my own suffering included. I felt the real pain of humanity, and I could see the transgenerational aspects of this in myself as it came up for healing, the pain my children were facing, the barriers that they faced, and the possible barriers that my grandchildren would face. I began to see why I was attracting the diverse people, Black women, LGBTQ people, trans people. And there were lines of them thanking me. And it was a really very heartening, emotional experience, because each one of these clients had brought something to me and taught me something too. And as I always find as a therapist, it's a two-way process, if it's good. However, integration was another thing. Because I kept having these experiences, I could see that the facilitators, actually not the woman, but the man, who's a white man, was getting increasingly impatient with me having these experiences. As I listened to others integrate their experience, when I attempted to integrate my own experience, I was met with impatience, denial, claims of reverse racism, invalidation, lots of spiritual bypass, but we are all one. But if you don't act like you're back, you won't attract these situations. Try telling the police that, you know. I knew what was happening, but I knew it would take a 3-hour workshop to reach the level of empathy required. And so, not to embarrass the facilitator with my knowledge, I was silenced. And it did feel like unrequited love. And I think that's what racism actually does. It's unrequited love. So I silenced myself and just agreed and sat full of rage, whilst I was so open after an ayahuasca experience. I didn't get to integrate my experience, and I was frustrated while very vulnerable, and I couldn't leave. It was my house. So again, I worked through this in therapy, and luckily enough, my therapist is a transpersonal therapist and understands this kind of thing, although I had to teach him a bit about it because he had no experience of psychedelics. And so we worked through separating issues of power, you know, this white man and me not wanting to embarrass him, but actually silencing myself and realizing that I'd been internalizing that for a long time. So how do I communicate my experience? I stopped all contact with the two, and I ended the emotionally abusive relationship and moved on. So in 2017 to 19, I began a relationship with my previous partner, who was a white man and a really feminist guy, and began to share my worldview in a way that he hadn't experienced before. We watched together a really good encounter called The Colour of Fear with Lee Manoir. And I watched his comprehension. And it was something to witness his realization that this is nothing short of transformational. And so he stopped mansplaining, and he saw me completely differently. And in that moment, I realized, wow, so am I really seen as not who I am? And he realized, oh gosh, I'm always supposed to know the answer to everything. And he was able to relinquish that need to know, to be the one that knows. And he was really honest in his willingness to grapple with the situation and to grapple with the relationship. Many microaggressions that were still hurtful, I named, and we were able to get through it. And so it seems that while I wanted to give up smoking, ayahuasca had other plans for me. She seemed to want me to know about the facticity of my situation so that I could help individual clients transcend theirs. I worked with a sister circle, 6 women, with remarkably similar experiences, and this helped validate the experiences I had. These women were smart women who knew the words to fit their experience. And so the group provided mirroring, validation, and a safe space to pour out our pain, our insight, and our experiences of anti-blackness and sexism. And the universal feeling in the group was that of being the mothers of civilization and humanity and love of all humanity. And that real sadness and poignancy of unrequited love and stolen history. Moving on to 2018, I was just preparing to start this course I'm in the final year of, the advanced diploma in transpersonal therapy, which works with the alchemical process of transformation. And so on my own, I had a journey with the mushrooms, and I got this message. Your mission is humanitarian, and when you become absorbed in worrying about your addiction, your focus is with you. You're on mission. That's why we sent you here. And I thought, who is we? And they replied, the collective unconscious and you, of which you are incomparable. So in preparing for this course, we were asked to read the introduction to a book called Anatomy of the Psyche. Great book. And so I'm just going to read a little bit of that. And I'm glad I was laying down when I read it. Collective thinking is revealed by a preoccupation with whether or not one is normal. To the extent that one is a separate, unique world of being, there can be no norms, since a norm is an average of many. The individual psyche is and must be a whole world within itself in order to stand over and against the outer world and fulfill its task of being a carrier of consciousness. For the scales to be balanced, the individual must be of equal weight to the world. Ooh. Okay. And so I started the course and was immediately triggered. Loads of alchemical, what I call riddles, and all of them with European faces. And I found it difficult to find anything positive about me in the imagery. It became increasingly distressing. And so off I went again for my me search. I found out about race-based traumatic stress from Robert T. Carter, started to look at the work of Monica as well. Unable to share how I experienced the material without some backlash, and becoming more aware of feeling that sense of being eclipsed again, erased, I was silenced and furious. Although we were told that alchemy comes from Kemet, which is Egypt, that was the most of it. The rest was all about Greek and Roman philosophy, which obviously came out of Kemet. So what was not said caused pain. What was said, I always had to seem to reverse it for it to make sense to me. It was as if it was two opposites. For instance, we find it hard to be identified with the body. For me, it's hard not to be identified with my body. I began to feel, is there something wrong with me? Am I going insane? I felt profound fear. And again, my therapist was there saying, why are you splitting? You know what it is. Why are you doing that? And so I stayed in my sense of self more and more. And so as part of that alchemical transformation, I'll read this quote. "I am my situation, which shapes and limits me, but I also transcend my situation through choices and attitudes that decide its meaning. My existence is both at once transcendence and facticity. And for me, that means speaking my truth as I know it and I experience it." Hillman describes in the first three of the 4 stages of alchemy. In some, during Negredo, there is a pain and ignorance. We suffer without the help of knowledge. During Albedo, the pain lifts, having been blessed by reflection and understanding. The yellow, the citrinitas, brings the pain of knowledge itself. The soul suffers its own understanding. So still, at college, the centrality of whiteness, the curriculum, the imagery, all bothered and infuriated me. I squirmed, bursting as if I was containing everyone in the group that couldn't see it. In therapy, my therapist said, "Why do they have to see it?" But then he did this amazing YouTube video, which he does as part of a series called Being the Other. And he said this: "The internal and the external are not divorced from one another. They interact with each other all the time. Any path to individuation has to flow through the other. You can't individuate unless you're willing to work with your experiences of the other." Or one can question, is one individuating at all? And so, coming to the end of term last year, I spoke out again in the group. This time, knowing how racism functioned, I tried again, preempting the claims and assumptions that would occur. I began to know the script as it comes. And I found I was not alone among the other therapists. Some saw it. One told me about an article that speaks to my pain. A big elephant to me became something of a whiff of something to some of the others. And I felt a sense of validation of others noticing the subtlety of it and that it was actually happening in real time. One colleague said, "It's happening now, isn't it?" I'm like, yes, it's happening now. As they tried to tell me how to deal with my experience that they couldn't possibly understand. So this time was the first time I didn't freeze, I didn't fight, I didn't flight, I stayed in my neocortex. I had begun to transform. On my late father's birthday last year, I received a message. Remember Billy from 2012, that course that I was on? She had listened to Russell Brand interview Kahindi Andrews for Under the Skin. And she'd sent me this message, which she's kindly allowed me to share. I listened to this a long time ago and it remains one of my favourite podcasts ever. I didn't fully understand what you spoke of at university, and I thought of you lots as I listened and felt myself wake up. I feel sorry. I just wanted to let you know that. That was a beautiful moment for me. All the pain dissolved immediately as I typed back how happy I was. She didn't have to actually message me, and it meant a lot to me, and it felt like that gestalt had been completed, a real sense of completion. So, having kind of told you my story, the things that I noticed in my ayahuasca experiences, which could be the same for psilocybin, I'd say, is what I and others may need to feel safe. Music and rhythm are important. Space to move around and embody the experience is really important. And a safe integration. Please don't pee over the sacred. In terms of music and rhythm, I come from a Guyanese background and love hearing the music of Indian Sanskrit mantras and also indigenous music from the Americas. all of that is what I know when I go to Guyana. At one point during one ceremony, it became really jarring to hear this white guy singing these types of songs. And during one of the experiences, it seemed relentless. At one point, he started singing Bob Marley, and I could have died. So on playlists, I would ensure there is enough music of the African diaspora, including traditional West African music, calypso, Latinx, political reggae and dub. This is important because this is how we speak to our oppression. Obviously, other world music is great, but the point is how often Africa tends to be excluded. We need space. I mean, we need space. There is something that sometimes happens when I have psilocybin. There is a particular ancestor that comes along and takes over my body and makes me dance in such a way that I can't possibly do here now. And so we need space to do that. We're definitely into drums and ecstatic dance. And for this, we need space to express ourselves. Sometimes headphones for music doesn't allow the sharing with a companion, and that could be a shame. Options could include sharing music with the companion in the latter stages of the journey. For the African, the highest value is in the relationship between you and I. Instruments too are really important. I remember the first ayahuasca experience, I took over the drum and don't know how to play it, but somehow did when I was in that experience. Maracas and other instruments might also be helpful. I cannot stress enough the importance of interactive music in the latter stages of the journey through psilocybin. In terms of integration, I would say that what would be helpful would be offshoot groups for Black people and people of colour. And that anti-Blackness is such that Black people may only feel safe to share in a group made up of Black and mixed Black people. And it would be helpful to have a Black person facilitate that group. People of colour that can facilitate these experiences with an in the bones experience of racism. And that doesn't necessarily mean that every person of colour has come to terms with these experiences. 10 years ago, I, as a Black woman, would not have had the words to name my experiences, subtle as they do present in the UK. So an understanding of the stages of racial awareness development would be essential, I think, and knowing where one is on those stages of development would be key. And so it's an ongoing process of transformation. It's not about me shutting down my true self and my true feelings, no matter how hostile I experience my audience to be or how upsetting it might be for them. It is upsetting for me. No matter how I might be perceived, I cannot betray myself any longer. One experience of psilocybin would probably not do either, to peel back the layers of oppression, which is often internalized, and those voices are heard within. So this is an ongoing process, and I wouldn't do this justice without mentioning Iboga, which has internalized a really great bullshit meter. That's about it. So I'm happy to take any questions or see where you'd like to go with that.
Thank you so much for that Jill. Thank you for sharing that very personal reflection. It's very insightful. I'm seeing some comments saying this is amazing. Thank you so much. And I'd like to extend that as well. Yeah, I guess we have a couple of minutes before the next speaker, if anyone wanted to ask any questions briefly. You can either type it in the chat or also raise your hand, and we can take probably one question now.
I don't know how to do the hand raising.
That's fine. You can go for it.
Thank you. One of the things, I'm a meditation teacher, and I have worked with entheogens individually. And one of my main concerns is, or this problem that I come up against, is merging the Western, modern, scientific thinking and world, which is kind of foundationally very much white and male dominated in its thinking and just the way that it works. How to really genuinely and safely merge this with the traditional, the ancient, the indigenous way of thinking, way of functioning, way of understanding. And so I have personally shied away from academia. I've shied away from science because I have felt that even just in the process of attempting to adapt the traditional to make it fit the conventional or the Western, that already kind of takes the magic out, or that already does a disservice to the ancient tradition. So I've been wondering and grappling with, is there a way that we can maintain the integrity of the sacred, make that the foundation, and then find a way to incorporate from the Western, from the scientific, and adapt that to fit the traditional model versus trying to, so this is a big question. And I'm just kind of wondering how we can, rather than bending ourselves, bending our history, bending our tradition to fit into what the standard has become because of who has created the standard, how can we keep the integrity in ourselves and in our traditions, and then find a way to normalize or mainstream that and keep it safe?
Really interesting question. The question I've been asking myself since 2014. It's a weird one, because here I am, born in London, and it feels like I am that bridge between sort of the West and the indigenous, and it's difficult. My idea is, you know, doing the work in the Western way, but also going and learning from the indigenous people themselves about how we can integrate the two. And it's not been done before, I don't think, in that way. I think that's us. I think what you're speaking of, Amber, is that's what we have to do somehow, because we are the ones that find ourselves in the West. So that's what I would say. It's for us to find that way as the bridge. I assume that's why I was born here. You know, that's what gives it meaning for me. And as part of that, I'm intending to go back with my mum the next time she goes to Guyana, and go down south to where the Amerindians live and ask them that myself. That's the plan, to get them in touch. But I know that many feel that it would be kind of disrespectful to use ayahuasca in the way the West uses it. And I can understand that too. So that's where we are. There's the intention. The intention is to find a way to marry the two in that alchemical conjunctio way. I hope that's helpful.
Great, thank you so much for that. I can see there's a couple more questions in the chat, but I think we'll probably leave that towards the end, and then you guys can have a bit of a discussion about it. So thank you again. And so moving on to our next speaker for this evening, and our next speaker is Dr. Monica Williams. So Dr. Williams is a licensed clinical psychologist and associate professor at the University of Ottawa in the School of Psychology. She's published over 100 book chapters and peer-reviewed articles focused on anxiety-related disorders and cultural differences. She's currently a member of several boards and organizations, including the American Psychological Association, the Board of Chacruna Institute for Psychedelic Plant Medicines, and the Association of Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies. Dr. Williams has served as a principal investigator on a trial for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD and consults with organizations to address diversity issues and improve cultural competence. Dr. Williams is the clinical director of the Behavioral Wellness Clinic in Tolland, which serves adults and families with OCD, PTSD, and anxiety disorders. So yeah, doing some amazing work in this field, and we're very grateful to have her here today to present her talk titled Racial Trauma and Psychedelic Therapy. So yeah, I'll hand it over to you, Dr. Williams.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. I'm gonna just take a minute and share my screen so you can see my presentation. And I was just, I so much enjoyed and was so moved by Gil's talk. I mean, I think it really sets up what I'm going to say very well. So thank you for your openness and honesty, and I so respect your journey. And so what I'm going to talk about is racial trauma and psychedelic therapy. And my presentation is today is going to be sort of centered on the experiences of Black people. And because of, I center it here because this is my heritage. A lot of this will also apply to other people of color and marginalized groups as well. But I'm not going to apologize for centering the voices of Black people today. So anyway, here's a little bit about myself, which I already had a fantastic introduction, so I don't need to go over this. But I do wear a lot of hats as a clinician and a researcher and a mom. So there are many things that are central to my identity and my professional life and personal life as well. And I'm just going to start off by, saying that psychedelic-assisted psychotherapies, they're being vigorously researched right now, and I'm sure probably none of this is new to those of you who are present today, but there are many different substances that are being studied in terms of their potential for psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. There's many disorders that are being researched with the use of these substances, and there's many different psychotherapies that are being used in one way or another with these medicines. And this makes me very interested as a psychologist, because these are all things I have a great interest in. And one of my main interests is, well, the reason I became a psychologist was to help people with emotional pain, really. And certainly there's a lot of pain that is necessary as we grow, but there's also a lot of pain that isn't necessary. Pain from traumas, pain from being racialized. And I think this is the pain we don't need. And so there have been a lot of questions in terms of, can psychedelic-assisted therapies help with trauma, help with depression, anxiety? And question I have is, can psychedelics be a tool for healing from racism? Also, as these medicines are moving into the mainstream, how can we assure as a field that mental health professionals, clergy, guides, and facilitators are ready to do this important work with people of color, people from different cultural groups, right? So to work well with people of color in Western contexts, and particularly to work well with Black people, you must understand a little bit about racism, right? And so I find I have to often define and explain what racism is. There are many types of racism. There's old-fashioned racism, which you sort of think of as also called dominative racism, sort of a traditional kind of bigotry, you know, I hate you because you're Black. Very simple. Most people don't admit to having this kind of racism, even though they might. It's fallen out of fashion to be publicly racist. So we have other ways of being racist without calling it racist. One type of racism is called symbolic or modern racism, and this is the kind of racism where people will say they don't like certain groups because like their culture is bad, or their values are bad, or they don't work hard, or people will make very sweeping negative generalizations about different groups, basically as an excuse to hate on them. And then we also have other forms of racism that we see more even in progressive, liberal-minded individuals. Aversive racism is a type of racism where people say that they support equality, they say they're egalitarian, they say they're anti-racist, they say they're feminist, but they do racist things. And this is really tough too for people like us, people of color, because it's very confusing, because you have people out of one side of the mouth saying how against racism they are, but their actions tell a different story. And it's thought that a lot of these behaviors are unconscious, which doesn't make it okay. And then microaggressions are small, subtle types of racism we experience on a regular basis. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. But many microaggressions are covert. And then we have structural racism. And I'm so glad there's been a larger conversation about structural racism these days, because it's so easy to point the finger at one person and say, oh, that cop was a bad apple. But the problem is not bad apples. The problem is the structure that allows those bad apples to continue to inflict harm. And so structural racism is present in all of our social systems, all of our institutions, our universities, our systems of government. Any place where there's an unequal outcome, there's structural racism. So easy to identify. Now, part of the issue is that there tends to be a divided perspective on what constitutes racism. White people in our society tend to believe that racialized groups are doing well in life, that racism is no longer an issue and discrimination is declining, and that they personally are not capable of racist behaviors. Whereas people in racialized groups are confronted with daily acts of racism, and so we have a very different racial reality. And the problem is that white people tend to limit their definition of racism to blatant, intentional, overt acts, that very few people who commit racist acts will admit to doing it intentionally. They won't admit to wanting to harm others due to race. So under this definition, very few acts of racism would actually be defined as racism. And even good people enact racism. So this is really important to understand, that even though people may not behave in racist ways as far as they can tell, we are still having racist outcomes, and that's because everybody's being a little bit racist. And some people are being a lot racist, but it only takes a lot of people being a little bit racist to have really bad outcomes. And here are a few examples of the types of outcomes that are produced in this way. This is an example from the United States, where I am from. We see vast disparities between Black and white Americans in just about every important thing we can measure, right? So I don't have to go through this list. You can read it and get the point that that Black people are are not doing as well as white people, and they have and I think the wealth gap is huge, and the infant mortality gap is huge, and the maternal mortality gaps is huge in terms of really understanding the impact of racism, because these differences are not just are not explained simply by income. Even affluent Black women are still suffering high infant mortality rates, high maternal death rates. So, so it's not, we can't just say it's income. We have to be willing to look at the fact that racism is behind these things. And then these are the mental health outcomes of racism, and this is really my area of study, racism and mental health. And all of these conditions, everything we've ever tried to measure scientifically, as far as disorders go, can either be caused or made worse by racism. And these are all peer-reviewed empirical articles or scholarly reviews that find that racism is connected to many negative mental health outcomes. And sometimes we call this racial trauma because experiencing racism is traumatic. And when we think about trauma, those of us in the mental health field, and I think a lot of lay people too, tend to think about problems like, tend to think about people who've been raped or in combat, and that's the sort of thing that traumatizes you. But there are a lot of other things that cause trauma too, particularly, and there are a lot of things that we don't think about necessarily as traumatizing, but are traumatizing for people of color. Particularly, in our Black and brown communities, we have police harassment, search and assault. So make no mistake, when a police puts a gun to your head and says, give me an excuse to shoot you, this is traumatic. This is a life and death experience. Workplace discrimination. I've seen so many people traumatized by the ongoing assaults from coworkers and bosses. Community violence, murder of loved ones, incarceration, better believe that's traumatic. Distressing medical and or childbirth experiences, very traumatic. Additionally, there's traumas that are not uncommon for immigrants and refugees. Traumas such as experiencing or witnessing torture, ethnic cleansing and persecution, destruction of cultural practices, which also has happened to many indigenous groups, living in a war zone, immigration difficulties. You can believe that being put in a cage is traumatic. Deportation. So think about how it might affect a child seeing their parents, grabbed by immigration officers and then having no idea what happened to them, right? So these are traumatic things. And then and racial trauma is felt globally, right? It's not just in the States. It's not restricted to one town or community. People all over the world are feeling racial trauma. And there is systemic racism and oppression in law enforcement, in many countries. I think we all recognize where this picture came from, the killing of George Floyd, done very brazenly, coldly by law enforcement. While people looked on, then the police were like, you can't stop us. We're gonna kill this guy. You wanna watch? Even as he said, please, I can't breathe, officer. I got this text message from my niece when she saw the footage. She said, I just read about this terrible thing that happened where a Black man was killed by the police. And the video was so awful that I cried, and I don't know who to talk to about it. So I called you because it's so late that my mom's asleep. She lives in Germany, and she was traumatized by this. So these things are affecting Black people everywhere. I live in Canada now. There are racial problems in Canada too. Did not escape it, and some people feel that the indigenous populations in Canada are even worse off than Black people in America. It did not take long to find many instances where this is true, as well as large-scale data that's been collected as well Keep in mind that Canada's last segregated school wasn't closed until 1983. And there are ongoing problems with reproductive rights of women being violated, including the sterilization abuse of Indigenous women, which has happened in the United States for Black women, and is happening now in our prison system. So this is going on. This is going on now. Racism is a problem in the UK as well. And here's a commentary where someone writes that the racism that killed George Floyd was built in Britain. So this has created plenty of racial trauma. There's racial trauma all over the place. And so when you're doing psychedelic therapy with people of color, it should be no surprise that racial material emerges. And psychedelic therapists need to be able to work with this material competently and comfortably. So imagine you're the therapist and your client is on a journey and says, I feel a heavy weight on me. It's the weight of centuries of hate and oppression. There are white people's hands coming from all directions, grabbing and pulling at me, right? You're the therapist. And certainly there are times in a journey where you sit back and you don't speak or intervene. But imagine this is one of those times that calls for a response from you. What do you say? And my observation so far is this most white people have no idea what to say, right? Even people who've done a lot of guiding, facilitating. So this tells me that that we need a lot of work in terms of getting mental health professionals to the place where they can work well with people of color. Now, not all abuses are so obvious. I mentioned microaggressions. I wanted to talk about microaggressions briefly. These are small racist acts. They're not clearly racially motivated. There's always some other excuse for them, but they cause a lot of distress and uncertainty in people who are the targets of these. One study observed a community college interactions, and they recorded microaggressions happening in 30% of classrooms. So we know they're very common. And if you know how to identify them, they're not hard to spot. Microaggressions can be defined as deniable acts of racism that reinforce pathological or false stereotypes about people, reinforce inequitable social norms and power differentials, and or communicate exclusion. So here are a few examples of microaggressions, types of microaggressions. I won't go over all of these, but these are some categories that have been identified in the research. And microaggressions are not only things people say, but they're also, they can also be in the environment, right? So you go into a clinic and there's no depictions of people of color anywhere, the artwork, magazines, nothing, right? This is a microaggression, and it communicates a message to people like me that that we're not thought of, we're not considered, right? And so all of these things can contribute to traumatization. As you've learned, many of us have cultural trauma due to historical legacies of traumatization, due to oppression of our communities. We have cultural trauma. And then on top of that, we have challenges around microaggressions, everyday racism. And then you may have a few traumatic events that push a person over from being simply stressed to being traumatized. And this can be something large, it could be something small, but most of us have had several traumatic events. And then when we try to get help, try to process what's happened to us, to facilitate our own healing, often we're met with invalidation, right? People don't see or recognize our pain. They feel threatened by it, so they invalidate it, excuse it, change the subject, right? And that inhibits healing. And then we may deal with structural racism. And for example, in terms of barriers to care, we maybe cannot find a clinician or a guide or facilitator from our own group. or there may not be opportunities in our communities. There may not be the type of mental health that we need. So these are all real problems, and as a result, trauma can grow and grow and grow. Yeah. So the question I've been interested in is, can psychedelics heal racial trauma? And we see there's a lot of trauma to go around. It's not just in the States. And this was one of the questions I have been asking through my work in psychedelic research. To get a handle on the scope of the problem, our lab looked at all the randomized controlled trials that had been done for psychedelic-assisted therapy. We found that the vast majority, as has been pointed out, of people in these trials were white. Only 2.5% were African American. And so again, as we think about the psychedelic experience for people of color, we have an example here where a woman says, "I feel so alone, like I'm invisible, like a ghost. I'm yelling, shaking people, and no one hears me. I float around and no one sees me. It's because I'm a Black woman," right? Many of us feel this way. And again, as a therapist, how do you respond, right? So we are doing some work, some research, looking at psychedelics and racial trauma. Right now, we've collected some data, some naturalistic survey data from people of color in the US and Canada, and asking people about how they've used psychedelics to cope with racial trauma. And the results are I've found very interesting. We see that, that people are having changes in their mental health symptoms. The greater the intensity of the mystical experience, the greater intensity of the insight, the bigger the change in the symptoms. We see reductions in racial trauma symptoms, stress, depression, anxiety. And also challenging experiences seem to reduce this effect. And certainly some challenging experiences are to be expected and are necessary with psychedelic healing. But for our participants, this type of challenging experience was not helpful. And these were experiences such as feeling that one may be dying, or that one's not safe during their journey, or that they're alone, right? And so these kinds of feelings were not helpful. And if you think about the experience of being a racialized person, it makes sense that in order to have a productive journey, you need to feel safe. How can you feel safe when you know that people around you are maybe looking down on you? There may be dangers, there may be law enforcement ready to persecute you, right? So it may be harder to have those feelings of safety. Nonetheless, the data was very good, and I do believe that Black people should embrace psychedelic healing. I think it is our birthright that has been taken from us, you know, and I think that some of this is going to mean making our own culture around the use of psychedelics, right? The Eurocentric framework for healing may not suit us, and that's okay. I think we need to make our own way. And also, I'm super excited about a paper I wrote recently with two other Black women, and it's called three ethnic and racial themes from 3 Black women therapists. And as far as I can tell, there's no published literature, none that I could find, on the experience of Black women and psychedelics. So we might be the first ones to ever publish this, which, if that is true, it's kind of sad, actually, that's never been looked at before. But I think, but our voices, I think, are really important. And you're going to see that two out of 3 of us actually had, there were some seriously negative pieces to the journey because the container wasn't good, and the therapist didn't understand that they were enacting racism even in the course of what was supposed to be a healing journey. So my work continues. We are we're in the planning phases now of doing some more work with MDMA-assisted psychotherapy at my clinic in Connecticut. where we are going to be prioritizing people of color with racial traumas. And that's going to be starting soon. So super excited about that. I'm going to stop there and just share a couple resources for those of you who are clinicians who are looking for materials. People are asking me all the time. This is a edited volume I put together last year on eliminating race-based mental health disparities. This one just came out this month on managing microaggressions. And so I think these are like really important tools, because I think you have to have some of these basics down before you can work well with people of color. And I think there's a lot of danger when you're doing psychedelic therapy to cause harm, because these are such powerful substances. So you want to be on your game. Here's a few references, and I'll stop there and just say thank you, everyone, for having me here today. And if there's any questions now, I'm happy to answer them or later.
Thank you so much for that, Monica. That was really interesting. I know I definitely learned a lot. I know there are some questions coming in already, and Catherine's been keeping an eye on the chat, so I'll just hand it over to her to chair the Q&A between you and Jill.
All right, thank you so much, Monica and Jill, for your presentations. We're going to move on to the panel discussion now, which hopefully will be quite an interactive and engaging chat with everyone here. So I'm going to go back to the questions which were put in the chat, and we can start the conversation that way. If you'd like to ask a question, you're very welcome to put it in the chat. If you know how to use the raise your hand function and would like to ask the question verbally, you can do that too, and we'll sort of just go with the flow. So I'm going to go back to one of the questions which was asked earlier, if I can find it, by Buki, who I hope is still here, who asks, particularly for Jill, but Monica, of course, if you have any comments, you can contribute. What would your advice be for deciphering less obvious messages from psilocybin? Are there specific methods to try and break down some of the symbolism or visions?
I find, well, more or less nowadays, I do it on my own. And what I tend to do is have my pad and paper ready, my pen and paper ready to write things like symbols and things like that down. During ayahuasca experiences, I kept seeing symbols that I didn't quite understand, but later I found out that they were Adinkra symbols from Ghanaian ancestry. So I guess that was part of it, and part of the experience was whenever I went into the experience, the first thing I would see was gold, which would turn into kente cloth, kind of just telling me where I'm from. So it's pretty easy to decipher those. But as I spoke earlier about the message I got from the mushrooms, from the psilocybin, that was something I thought, God, write that down, because you're going to forget, which is often what happens. It's very fleeting and it's very profound at the time. And then it's like, I just don't remember what it was. So I always take a pen and paper. And I would also say possibly coloured pencils if something comes up that you want to draw as well. That might help.
May I ask how you came to find the symbol afterwards?
Complete accident. Went into a shop called Hub and Culture in Peckham, and there they were. Yeah.
Beautiful coincidence, or maybe not.
Or maybe not. Synchronicity even.
All right. Is there anyone else with a question? Yes, Amber, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi. Thank you. I know that one of the very important things in particular with working with entheogens is the process of integration. And I would imagine with any kind of therapeutic process, there has to be, there's an opening and a closing, and then some sort of buffer space or transitional process wherein a person can be supported in working with what has been uncovered and then incorporating all of this new insight into kind of their new life once they move on from the experience. And so in my personal experience, one of the things that's been very challenging, so most of my experiences with mushrooms, that there is this opportunity to have this great insight, to uncover this wisdom. And then when we return to here, and particularly when it comes to racial trauma, there's this very stark contrast, because there may be this understanding, this insight, this wisdom that comes, and then there's a very obvious difference in the real world and the way that things then play out. And that can almost be a new trauma in a sense, because it's like, okay, there's something more, there's something greater. I'm starting to understand, I'm finding myself. And then you kind of come back to this place where none of it seems to matter. So I'm curious how the integration process, just if there's any advice or any particular measures that have been taken in the clinical context that particularly speaks to how people of color, women, Black people in particular, how we can safely re-enter this reality, tools that we can use, or are there physical places, what are the ways that we can not kind of be shocked back into this reality?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think it is so important to have people who are skilled and understanding to process these experiences with. I mean, and I see this happen so often. You know, people share their experiences with people who don't understand or don't appreciate what's come up, and then before you know it, you're kind of like doubting if there was any meaning there at all. And I really, you know, and I really just echo what Jill said about writing it down and journaling it, and then also like hanging on to your truth. Don't let anybody take that away. But you want to have people around you who understand, who will encourage you, who will build you up, and will, affirm you holding on to that reality. And then I also find that, after like a really draining journey, sometimes you just need time by yourself, because the weight of the oppression, of the racism is so heavy that that I find that like having a few days of space really makes a big difference. So yeah, I don't know if you want to add anything, Jill.
Yeah, totally agree. There's you really raise a good point, Amber. There's something about protecting yourself when you're vulnerable after an experience like that. Even you noticed dotted through my presentation was always my transpersonal therapist, a Black man, always. And after I seem to intuitively book him in for afterwards, to go and see him and gain some understanding and to work through and process what happened, because the integration wasn't doing it. I didn't get a chance to do that for the reasons that Monica's mentioned. So it really speaks to that kind of second skin that we need to have just to survive this normally, let alone after an experience like that, where our heart is just open. and all of our system is open. Yeah. It's a sacred space, so it needs to be treated as such.
Thank you for your question, Amber. So one question from before, from Jay Kaliste, apologies if I pronounce that wrong. Could you tell us a little bit more about Iboga? A little bit more.
Yeah, you know, I don't know why I left Father Iboga out, because he's the one who gave me my mouth, you know. I could so easily silence myself after being silenced so often. And the bullshit meter that Iboga provides means I cannot. I cannot. I have to say, hey, what's going on here? What do you mean exactly now? So it's helped me find my voice, and that's been powerful, and especially as a woman, it's really taught me to say no, not doing that right now. Other than that, I wouldn't say it was. It didn't seem particularly visionary, but it provided a kind of seeing the world anew. And the lady that supported me through that was a little old white lady. And when she spoke to me about this, me doing this, she said, oh, Iboga loves its own people. And that was my experience. You know, I hear that Father Iboga can be really quite tough, but not with me. It was really the most gentle father, and possibly just what I needed, because my father wasn't so gentle because of the transgenerational trauma. You know, he was pretty much a little slave master in our house. Yeah. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, and I would say I haven't ever worked with Iboga, and I do feel it's a little bit, when I talk about you know, kind of having your cultural birthright stolen. I feel this kind of falls into that category for me.
Absolutely. I mean, we didn't even know, you know, this was the last one I heard about, and it seems to be used for addiction in the West, but of course in West Africa, Gabon, it's used for spiritual transformation, it's used for hunting, it's used for all sorts of things, and for gaining clarity most of all. And I think that's what it did for me, that gaining of clarity and being quite succinct and short. It's the only way to describe it.
Thank you. Does anybody have a question? No, but I see some people are applauding, which is good. Okay, James has a question here. I'm curious about what I see as a tension between spiritual bypassing as a way of avoiding problems such as inherent racism, which definitely happens, and the desire to attempt to unify science and mysticism via psychedelics. And I'm wondering if the speakers could say a little bit more about this.
Well, I can definitely say a little bit, you know, as a you know, researcher and scientist. Going through graduate school, I was not taught anything about spirituality or religion. It's kind of not really like part of what I do, you know, like I do like math and collect data and, you know, do a lot of like scientific researchy things, and this spiritual mystic side has never really been a part of that. But what's been so interesting since I've started, you know, doing work with psychedelics, is how you really like can't get away from that when you do this. And I always find it so interesting and sobering to hear, you know, neuroscientists talk about spiritual experiences as they talk about their research, which, I mean, you never ever hear anybody talk about, you know, I was working with Prozac and had a spiritual experience, right? So there's definitely something about psychedelics that that is very different. And at the same time, I don't know that you have to marry science and mysticism. I kind of feel like I want like my mystical spiritual stuff to stay mystical. I don't really feel a need to turn that into numbers or anything. So so I don't think we have to marry them. I think they can live together side by side quite well, you know, but that's my opinion, I guess.
I guess it's a form of double bookkeeping.
Yeah.
Would anybody else like to comment or ask a further question on that point? Okay, so I was aware that Tonya had her hand up. Tonya, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask a question.
Oh, I'm sorry, that was an error. I was just looking at the chats and stuff. But thank you so much. This is very, very informative and very rich. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Tonya. Nice to hear your voice anyway. So a question from Carrie. As a white future therapist who hopes to work with psychedelics in a manner which is trauma-informed, especially regarding racial trauma, can you point me in the direction of any trainings, books, or other learning that's relevant to working with racial trauma from an outsider's perspective?
Yeah, and I think that it's really important if you're, you know, I mean, there are lots of white people who do really good work in this area, so I don't want to say any white person is disqualified from this. That being said, you do have to do your own work. And it's not going to be like, oh, I took a lunchtime seminar and now I can treat racial trauma. You know, it's an ongoing growth process in terms of being able to identify racism in you, how you've enacted and supported systems of racism, and what you're doing to dismantle racism. So this has to be part of your life in order for it to be a part of your work. And so I would say the first step is just really like, you know, learning what you can. There's like a lot of great resources just about race and racism in general. And you can't really like bypass that and take like a shortcut to say, okay, now I'm going to do like really good, you know, racial work with psychedelics. So you have to kind of start with some of the basics. And that was why I put those books up at the end, because there's a lot of really good foundational stuff in there about, you know, how to understand microaggressions, how to respond to them, how to not do them, how to repair from them, how to recognize them, right? Because the last thing you want to do is inflict that on people you're working with who may be coming for healing for racial trauma. You don't want to contribute to that. So, so I say doing your own personal work is a number one thing. And Jill, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, you know, as I went through my presentation, you saw what I did, and that's exactly the same as a white person. I am still finding little programs and picking them out of myself of internalized racism. So a day course really wouldn't do. It is an ongoing way of life to notice, you know, why am I thinking the way I'm thinking about certain groups of people? What is that about? It's really questioning my own thoughts, my own feelings, my own bodily reactions all of the time. And I would say that would be the same for anyone.
Yeah, and certainly all of us, we're all steeped in this racist environment, this racist culture. We're all affected by it, and I have to do my own work too constantly. And I'll do trainings on microaggressions. Sometimes I'll show little interactions, little microaggressive interactions as examples, you know, for kind of like what not to do. And then at the end I'll say, and actually like all of those microaggressions I showed you, those are all things I did. Okay, so none of us are immune, and it does take ongoing work, because think about it, you're like constantly bombarded. You have to put at least that much, if not more, energy into, you know, swimming up the stream the other direction in order to, you know, to stay balanced and non-racist. It's yeah, it's ongoing work, but it's worth it, I think, because yeah, I mean, what's the alternative, right?
Yeah, exactly. Being comfortable with being uncomfortable. It's a mechanism for growth. So we have another question here from Simon. In a recent talk, Rick Dublin from MAP said he wanted to start clinical trials looking at using ibogaine for addiction. Do you have any concerns regarding this and the future of ibogaine? I guess the future of ibogaine in the Western sphere.
I don't particularly have a concern about it as long as they're planting as they go. Because it's the sustainability that really worries me about that. What I would say is the cost of that compared to ayahuasca, which has gone, you know, we've got so much tourism with that. I'm concerned that that would be the same with the West African root plant, which you can get pretty cheaply at the moment. So my concern is demand and supply, pretty much, which of course is part of capitalism, which of course is part of white supremacy. So there we go again. It always comes back down to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think ibogaine potentially has quite a lot to offer. That being said, you know, I don't necessarily feel qualified to weigh in on this, since I'm not, you know, like an iboga practitioner. I think that they might have other thoughts about it, but I do think that it has the potential to be very, very important, you know, in terms of this work.
Thank you for those answers, and thank you, Simon, for the question. Cliff asks, what do the speakers think about intergenerational trauma in general, and more specifically, do white people suffer from generations old trauma they have inflicted on people of color?
I would say definitely yes, but also I would also qualify that too. I mean, you have to ask yourself, well, if people have been very cruel to another whole group of people, like, where did they learn that, right? So, you know, generally, like, you know, in psychology, like, we'll say hurt people, right? So you go back far enough and you will find that most of groups oppressing other groups have been oppressed before. So it goes back to the beginning of time, and I think all of us need healing from from this intergenerational trauma in one way or the other.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. I'm about a mile and a half away from the Tower of London, and I guess you know what happened at the Tower of London. There's all sorts of contraptions there for torture, all sorts. You know, the Middle Ages was not a great time. You know, the European was escaping from here and the trauma that was happening here. And wherever they went, they inflicted that trauma because it was not healed. And so that's why we all need healing.
Yeah. All right, we have a question from Paula. How can non-Black researchers get involved in the process of diversifying the field without risking speaking for people of color and contributing without benefiting? In some examples they give are money or fame at the expense of the people whose voices we want to raise, and how can we use our privilege to create space and opportunities for people of color to speak themselves?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and you know, and it's not easy, because actually what we really need, we need allies, right? I mean, you know, in order, you know, groups that are oppressed, I mean, generally it's an everyone problem, right? Because people are being oppressing of the oppressors. It's not just a Black problem or a white problem, it's everyone problem. And so everyone needs to come together to solve it. And so I don't think that anybody is unqualified or automatically disqualified from being a part of the conversation. But I do think if you're in a privileged group, if you are getting advantages, because you're part of a privileged group, it's important that you recognize that that's at the expense of other people who aren't privileged. So you have a responsibility to give back that privilege. And for every person, it's going to be different how you do that. But you can just look around, take stock of your life, look at the advantages that you have. Look in your workplace. Are there people who are being mistreated due to their color that you can speak up for and be an advocate for? You know, I mean, I think it's really important to step up and be an ally. And a lot of people talk about allyship, and a lot of people will maybe do a little weekend course and have a little allyship certificate. But what makes you an ally is your willingness to step out, which means that other white people are not going to be happy with you for stepping out. And if you're not getting crap from other white people, you're not doing it right. So being an ally is hard, but it's necessary, and that's what really needs to happen to make a difference. You know, you can't be like an armchair ally. So
it's fascinating that you can get a certificate for allyship. So I've never heard of that before. Sorry, and it's I'm not going to say anything more. But we have another question here from Ali. I'm a clinical psychologist by trade and currently work primarily with young adults, 18 plus, involved with the criminal justice system. And as you can sadly expect, there are significant racial, class, and gender disparities in those that I work with, from majority Black and brown, lower socioeconomic status, and majority male. And these young persons' lives are often punctuated by many and varied forms of trauma. As a consequence, I've been thinking recently more and more about the absence of intergenerational coming-of-age healing rituals that are stripped from traumatized, racialized, and marginalized communities. Historically, cultures have included entheogens or psychedelics in these processes, and I'm wondering a bit about what you think is the future of psychedelics in the rediscovery of these processes, and what might community approaches that included psychedelics look like in a Western society.
Do you want to start with that one, Jill?
Yeah, I'm just thinking of the work of Darren Springer here, and I'm just thinking, wow, wouldn't it be great if we could send out some of those boys to West Africa for their initiation ceremonies. And from what I understand it is that those that take psychedelics are less likely to re-offend. So there's something about that. It would be great if we could have initiation ceremonies that initiated them into manhood in some way, that meant that they don't have to create their own, which seems to be going to jail or something.
Yeah.
That's what I would say.
And I think I mean, I don't know. I think that there's a lot of different problems here, and I don't think that psychedelics alone will fix it. But I do think that there is space, Ali, for you to be an advocate in this situation. I think it's really important to understand that, Black and brown kids don't behave worse than white kids. And so if they're caught up in this criminal justice system, it's not because they're criminals, it's because the system targets them. And this is really just that system playing out.
Thank you for your responses. I'm aware that people keep writing into the chat. If you'd like to ask a question verbally, you're also very welcome, or we can keep doing it this way as well. Does anybody have a question? Okay, well, in that case, I do have a question. I know that you both sort of spoke about Eurocentric medical provision, particularly in the UK and in the US, and how that sort of ties in with clinicians being able to spot and understand more subtle acts of racism or microaggressions within sort of identifying and diagnosing psychiatric conditions, and sort of how perhaps PTSD with its different categories of trauma might not perfectly fit some of the things you describe, and the importance, or what you think the importance is of people and who work in mental health in understanding the subtleties and the sort of diversity in these experiences and how they might present?
I think it's absolutely essential that, that our clinicians can understand and identify these things, because, this is, I see it, this is really one of the largest barriers to treatment. One of the biggest causes of mental health disparities is because so many people of color have already had so many bad experiences with, in healthcare. They don't want to have to go and talk to someone if they don't have to, because I don't know. I think everybody's had some experiences with feeling, dismissed or minimized by healthcare professionals, but we know for people of color this is very bad, and so, like a lot of us, we just don't want to open up to somebody that's part of that system. And if you go in and the first thing that happens is you experience a microaggression, you're not telling that person anything, right? So it is a matter of, it's a major public health problem. And clinicians do need to understand microaggressions. They do need to up their game here, because a lot of times they're the ones committing the microaggressions and contributing to the poor health to people that they have sworn to serve. So don't get me going on that one though. I'll be here all day.
Bottom of the line is that it's important and people need to step up. Anything you'd like to add, Jill?
No, I think Monica said it all there. I don't think I have much more to add. People just need to really do the work.
Sophie says, just to add to Carrie's query, I was wondering if you had any recommendations outside of academic literature that revolve around experiences of racial and intergenerational trauma, fictionalized accounts such as novels, poetry, films that you feel are particularly insightful and worth exploring.
I'm going to go first on that one because it's really, really interesting. The best book I've ever read, which I read when I was about 22, so more than half a lifetime ago, my daughter has just finished reading, and it's Roots. Simple as that. She read Roots. That gives you a good example of intergenerational trauma. I'd also say Joy DeGrue's Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome is an excellent book for seeing how that trauma plays out today in our behaviors, our learned behaviors, that can be mistaken for culture.
Yeah, I second that as far as Roots goes. Fantastic work there that really, just chronicles generations of people experiencing the whole kidnapped from Africa enslavement, and then how that legacy is passed on and on again. I also enjoyed the book My Grandmother's Hands. That's good too. I don't really have a lot of opportunities to do much leisure reading, but I'm going to try to improve in that way.
Yeah, Res Menachem. Yeah, absolutely. My Grandmother's Hands, excellent book. On my bookshelf, waiting to be read as well. So yeah, I get it.
All right, thank you.
I have another question.
Go on.
Just muted myself back. So one of the things that has been tricky and very painful is when you are thinking about the convention of what constitutes trauma, or the idea of wellness, being well versus not being well. It seems that since racism is so embedded in that convention, that there really isn't an option to not be traumatized if you are a Black person. And so I find that there's kind of fundamentally already this, you're kind of already unwell. And the idea of having to come to terms with that, or the idea of moving through the world in that way, and then what comes with attempting to reconcile that. So I don't know exactly what the question is here, but just understanding that, yes, racism is not normal and not okay in an absolute sense, but in terms of what we experience, it's something that we all know is just kind of here, that we didn't ask for, we didn't create ourselves, and then kind of emerging out of this culture, out of this society as individuals. It's kind of something that just wraps itself around us when we get here. So I've been curious about, when it comes to educating other people, speaking to children, all of this, what do we do with that? Do we just say, okay, we'll understand that anxiety, depression, et cetera, as a result of the racial trauma, is just something that you have to understand that is a part of you, and therefore all of us as Black people, or probably all people, should be receiving treatment anyway, therapies and other things, just for being human. But should all of us be seeking out care just to deal with this because it's already there? I don't know if there's a question, but just kind of trying to understand how to feel like you are okay, or that there is an okayness that you can ever feel.
Well, I can speak to my personal experience on that one. You know, in my family, coming from that Caribbean background, I was told that that's how it is. You know, I think that we get the same message, that we have to work twice as hard to get half as far. And in some ways that really wasn't helpful, because I didn't want to work hard at all then. You know, but in another way, you know, I totally ignored my parents. Oh no, mum and dad, you don't know, we're in England now, it doesn't happen anymore. That was me as a child. Denial, because that is what the dominant narrative said, and so I believed it even as it was happening. You know, even as it was happening. So that's what I mean by that kind of double consciousness. But those messages, when I went into the workplace and started to experience it, those messages kind of came back as a backup, you know. So even though I didn't listen to it at the time, they rang true later on and were helpful. What I did with my own children was I took that a step further and said, you can be whatever you want to be. There will be barriers. So become a good hurdler.
I love that. Yeah, we absolutely have to prepare our children for the reality of this. Otherwise, you know, they're going to be, you know, blindsided. And they can opt or not opt to listen, but at some point it will become relevant. I mean, I don't know any Black people living in, you know, the US or Canada or Germany. I don't know any Black people living in these white Western contexts that aren't traumatized or stressed out to some degree from it. So I do think, I mean, I maybe I'm a little biased. I'm a therapist. I think everybody could benefit from therapy anyway. But I do think that we need room to process these experiences. And it doesn't have to be a therapist. If you've got like some really super supportive people around you who can do that for you, that's great. Sometimes we don't have that. Like even my own parents, like if I tell them, oh, I experienced this microaggression, they're like, suck it up. We grew up during segregation. So, you know, it's not that they want to be unsupportive, and they definitely understand, but sometimes maybe even people in your family, you know, aren't that great source of support. So you do need that in some way. And I think therapy is a great way to get it, except it's hard to find therapists who know how to work with this stuff well. But yeah, if you have a lot of supportive friends, that could be a part of it too.
And I found the sister circle works really great for Black women as well. So if you can grab some friends and get together in a circle once a month and just pour it out, laugh it out. And, you know, it's amazing what we laugh at. You know, laughter is just the best medicine. And sometimes we laugh about the absurdity of the situation when we possibly want to cry.
Yeah.
But it's helpful.
Can I chime in quick?
Of course, yeah.
I agree with what you guys are saying in terms of getting our kids, or you know, the ones after us, to understand racism. I remember it was during one of my LSD trips was understanding fear, or coming to terms with fear. In, you know, growing up, you know, like Jill was saying, that, you know, my dad used to say, you know, when it comes to the law, you know, I already have my color, my identity, stuff like that, but that those things are already counted against me. So then I only have one strike. If I get in trouble, my ass is going to jail. There was a lot of fear-based that was in not only those words, but the ways that I was raised with my dad, where he incited a lot of fear to keep me on a correct path or something like that. Do you still tell them, hey, you know, because of your color, because of this, there's gonna be this thing? So like educating them about it, about the fear of it, do you incorporate that into the explanation, or rather just to allow them to be aware and allow them to process it themselves?
Yeah.
Over here in the UK, it's really my son I've had to concentrate on in terms of the law and how many times he's going to be stopped by the police. So that was something, as soon as he was getting a driver's license, I was telling him how he had to interact with the police. Luckily enough, over here they don't usually have a gun, so you know, it was about teaching him his rights. If I'd been in America, I would have taught him a whole different thing. It wouldn't have been about his rights. It would have been how to calm down the police officer. And I know that. So it really does depend on where you find yourself in the white Western world. I do love that word Western, you know, Western. What does it mean? It's funny that Australia is also in the West. So I don't know why we don't just call it the white world. This coded language. Anyway, I digress.
You know, and I do like that you talked about, instead of the whole fear mongering aspect of it, instead you let his rights and how to handle situations to put yourself in a better position. Whereas, you know, my brother, if he were to get, my brother's been, you know, locked up a number of times, but you know, he would fight instead and rebel, and I was just, you know, I had the fear instilled in me of just, you know, fucking keep your mouth shut, this thing will go a lot faster and such like that. So it's very interesting to hear. I don't think I've ever heard anybody just say, you know, hey, just teach your kids their rights, and then there, let them know, give them the tools to best combat without actually combating an officer or racism itself. So it's a really interesting take on it. Thank you.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily advocate teaching them to be afraid. I would advocate teaching them how to be smart in those situations. And at the same time, sometimes it's hard not to be afraid. I know I feel terrified of law enforcement. And I think some of that's just in my DNA, you know?
Yeah.
Okay, well, to end it, I'd just like to say a big thank you to our speakers, and thank you to everyone for coming tonight. Speaking about accessibility, we hope that the money that you've donated in the form of buying tickets can help via the organization for which we will donate to, which Asta spoke about earlier, through Black Minds Matter UK. So thank you all so much for coming. We will be continuing this series the next event probably will be in October, and we'd like to keep the conversation going. Obviously, hopefully see you there. And again, just my many thanks to the speakers for sharing and teaching, and for your contribution tonight, as well as for everyone who engaged. Thank you. And I can do the clapping emoji now.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great to meet you, Monica.
Yeah, likewise.